Hey Sec 5, I hope you're all doing well. So we're going to start off the class by finishing off with Chapter 4, the reading, and then we're going to get on a video chat and discuss the contents of Chapters 3 and 4. So the last we left off in Chapter 4, Nick went to lunch with Gatsby into the city, and Gatsby starts to tell him, things about his life, as he wants him to hear them. So we get to know Gatsby's character a little bit better through the things that he says, and also through his association with a man named Wolfsheim that we also meet in Chapter 4. And we know that he fixed the World Series, so we know that he's not a legitimate businessman or person. He is pretty crooked, and, we could probably learn a thing or two about Gatsby just based on this association. We'll talk a little bit more about it. We also learn that Gatsby has a favor that he wants to ask Nick, but he's only going to find out through Jordan Baker later that afternoon. So let's keep reading Chapter 4. There aren't that many pages left. I'll write down the page on the PDF to start off. So we're at the part where Nick is meeting up with Jordan Baker. He's having tea with her later that same afternoon that he went into the city with Gatsby. So it says, "One October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker that afternoon, sitting up very straight on a straight chair in the tea garden at the Plaza Hotel." So she's recounting a story from 1917. Again, our setting is 1922, so we're talking a few years back. So, "I was walking along from one place to another, half on the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had on shoes from England with rubber knobs on the soles that bit into the soft ground. I had on a new plaid skirt also that blew a little in the wind, and whenever this happened, the red, white, and blue banners in front of all the houses stretched out stiff and said, 'Tut, tut, tut,' in a disapproving way. The largest of the banners and the largest of the lawns belonged to Daisy Faye's house. She was just 18, 2 years older than me, and by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville." So she's talking about Daisy. Daisy's maiden name is Faye. "She dressed in white and had a little white roadster, and all day long the telephone rang in her house, and excited young officers from Camp Taylor demanded the privilege of monopolizing her that night, anyways, for an hour. When I came opposite her house that morning, her white roadster was beside the curb, and she was sitting in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. 'Hello, Jordan,' she called unexpectedly. 'Please come here.' I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me because of all the older girls. I admired her most. She asked me if I was going to the Red Cross to make bandages. I was. Well then, would I tell them that she couldn't come that day? The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking, in a way that every young girl wants to be looked at sometime, and because it seemed romantic to me, I have remembered the incident ever since. His name was Jay Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years. Even after I'd met him on Long Island, I didn't realize it was the same man. That was 1917. By the next year, I had a few beaux myself, and I began to play in tournaments, so I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older crowd when she went with anyone at all. Wild rumors were circulating about her, how her mother had found her packing her bag one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks. After that, she didn't play around with the soldiers anymore, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever. She had a debut after the armistice, and in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June, she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago, with more pomp and circumstance than Louisville ever knew before. He came down with 100 people in 4 private cars and hired a whole floor of the Mulbach Hotel, and the day before the wedding he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. I was a bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her lying on her bed as lovely as the June night in her flowered dress, and as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of Sauterne in one hand and a letter in the other. 'Gratulate me,' she muttered. 'Never had a drink before, but oh, how I do enjoy it.' 'What's the matter, Daisy?' I was scared, I can tell you. I'd never seen a girl like that before. 'Here, dears, She groped around in a wastebasket she had with her on the bed and pulled on the string of pearls. "Take 'em downstairs and give 'em back to whoever they belong to. Tell 'em all Daisy's changed her mind. Say, Daisy's changed her mind." She began to cry. She cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub with her and squeezed it up in a wet ball, and only let me leave it in the soap dish when she saw that it was coming to pieces like snow. So, just to kind of to fully understand what's going on, so Daisy was in a relationship with Gatsby in 1917. Then a few years later, he was going off to war, and her family didn't let her go to New York to see him. So she ended up getting engaged to Tom Buchanan. And so here, Jordan is recounting Daisy's wedding day, where she's drunk, she received a letter, and she's telling them to call off the wedding. She's changed her mind, but they don't know why. But she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back into her dress, and half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck and the incident was over. Next day at 5 o'clock, she married Tom Buchanan without so much as a shiver and started off on a 3-month trip to the South Seas. I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If he left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming in the door. So it's complete opposite of the Tom and Daisy that we've met. Where he's having an affair and she's aware of it, and, she, can't really do anything. She here is clearly, in love with him. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them together. It made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way. That was in August. A week after I left Santa Barbara, Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped a front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers too, because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel. The next April, Daisy had her little girl, and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Cannes, and later in Deauville, and then they came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, as you know. They moved with a fast crowd, all of them young and rich and wild, but she came out with an absolutely perfect reputation. Perhaps because she doesn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among hard-drinking people. You can hold your tongue, and, moreover, you can time any little irregularity of your own, so that everybody else is so blind that they don't see or care. Perhaps Daisy never went in for amour at all, and yet there's something in that voice of hers. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember, if you knew Gatsby in West Egg. After you had gone home, she came into my room and woke me up and said, "What Gatsby?" And when I described him, I was half asleep. She said in the strangest voice that it must be the man she used to know. It wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her white car. When Jordan Baker had finished telling all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving in Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of children, already gathered like crickets on the grass, rose through the hot twilight. "I'm the Sheik of Araby. Your love belongs to me. At night when you're asleep, into your tent I'll creep." It was a strange coincidence, I said. But it wasn't a coincidence at all. Why not? Gatsby bought that house so that Daisy would be just across the bay. Then, it had not merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendor. "He wants to know," continued Jordan, "if you'll invite Daisy to your house some afternoon and then let him come over." The modesty of the demand shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed starlight to casual moths, so that he could come over some afternoon to a stranger's garden? Did I have to know all this before he could ask such a little thing? "He's afraid he's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, he's regular tough underneath it all." Something worried me. So here we're getting to know a little bit about Gatsby. So the first time that we've met Gatsby, even though we didn't directly meet him, Nick was coming home and he saw Gatsby at the dock extending his arms wide into, like at sea. And we asked ourselves, like, why is he doing this? What is he reaching for? And now we find out that just across the bay are the Buchanans. And, according to Jordan, Gatsby bought this house right across the bay to be near to Daisy. So his request is that he'll go over one day when Nick invites Daisy over. Why didn't he ask you to arrange a meeting? He wants her to see his house, she explained, and your house is right next door. Oh. I think he half expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, went on Jordan, but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way, he kept saying. I want to see her right next door. When I said you were a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom, though he says he's read a Chicago paper for years just on the chance of catching a glimpse of Daisy's name. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism, and who leaned back jauntily just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired. And Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan to me. Does she want to see Gatsby? She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. You're just supposed to invite her to tea. We passed a barrier of dark trees, and then the facade of 59th Street, a block of delicate pale light, beamed down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no girl whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornices and blinding signs, and so I drew up the girl beside me, tightening my arms. Her wan, scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again closer, this time to my face. So we're seeing a little bit of a connection here between Nick and Jordan, but again, so it's funny because our main character is Nick, but the story's about Gatsby, so it's really funny how Fitzgerald has framed it. But so basically, we get an idea of, that Daisy really loved Gatsby because it seems that on her wedding day she received a letter that she was willing to give up everything, her entire future with Tom, over this one letter. And she was drinking on her, the day before her wedding, so she, was probably nervous about it. And we might see, that maybe she did love Tom once upon a time, but does she love him now? We don't know. We'll find out a little bit more. But we do get a sense a little bit more into her character and her past with Gatsby, even though we don't know the whole story. You guys are going to be writing your first reflection and your first journal, I should say, and basically you're going to be taking on the role of Daisy, and you're going to be writing as if you're writing into a journal as Daisy, about her romance with Gatsby and Tom, and you're going to be comparing the two. Obviously, you're going to be able to embellish a lot of details, but you should be staying true to Daisy's character, as we know Daisy. So we do know that Daisy was in love with Gatsby. Obviously, she was willing to give up her whole future with Tom for a letter, over a letter that Gatsby wrote her. She was willing to leave her life in Louisville and run to New York for Gatsby. And then things changed when she met Tom. So clearly she loves them both, or loved them both. We don't know now, but you're going to be writing on behalf of Daisy at this time in 1917, or a little later when she met Tom. And, talking about her feelings and her love for both men. Maybe she was in love with both at one point. We don't know. That's up to you. So what we're going to do is we are going to discuss chapters 3 and 4 together, and then you guys will have time to work on your journals. All right? So let's meet on video chat. Thanks, guys.